This slideshow and lecture will focus on new American diplomacy in the age of American imperialism. In 1899, by 1899, the United States had become a major power in the continent of Asia. And you can see kind of the parts of Asia that we're talking about right here on the map, right? China, and we're looking at our Philippines area that we talked about last slideshow in there. The reason there were a few different reasons for this. First off, Navy bases were everywhere in the Pacific Ocean. We had grabbed all these Spanish islands and annexed our own islands, and we had all these Navy bases dotted all around the Pacific Ocean. We also had the world's third largest Navy, so we were very powerful in that capacity, and it was easy for us to take the space there. And also, at this point, the economic reasons, the United States had their exports had increased to China by 4 times as much. Now, the Chinese were still only buying like 2% of American exports. It wasn't this huge amount of American exports, but understanding how many people there were in China and how big this market was for American products, and that people would buy these American products from them, that made the businesses in America very excited, which made them push for the government to get involved in this area. In 1894, a war was happening in Asia. This war happened between China and Japan. Now, China was a much larger country, and in 1894, Korea was an area that's what they were fighting over. China and Japan were fighting over this area of Korea, which was dependent completely upon China. So it was kind of its own country, but it was completely dependent on China, so kind of a part of China. China had this huge military, but was very easily defeated by the Japanese, which surprised a lot of the Western people, a lot of people around the world. And it showed that Japan had mastered this technology, and they were rising in power at this time. And so Japan defeated China, like I said, and they got territory in Manchuria. And we can see this picture that shows the area of Manchuria. Manchuria, Russia didn't like the idea of, because Russia's right here, didn't like the idea of Japan getting this power because they were becoming more and more powerful, and now they had land that was bordering Russia. And that made Russia a little bit nervous. And so Russia, with the help of Germany and Great Britain, came in and forced Japan to give that land back to China. And actually what ended up happening is Russia ended up leasing that land from China, so renting it out. So the land belongs to China, but Russia is the one that's in control of it. And so these land lease deals in China, where China had its own land, but it was really controlled by someone else, started to become very normal at this time in history. So at this point, China, seen as weak, started to be cut up by these European nations. And so Russia already had one, so now Germany, France, and Britain all started to demand these leaseholds in China. So they demanded these areas that they would control completely and rent from the country of China. And so now we started to see these different European spheres of influence in China. A sphere of influence is an area where a foreign country, some other country, controls economic development in an area of your country. And so they have all of the influence. They have that sphere of influence, this area of influence, where the influence belongs to another country. And so the United States came in and said, you know what, they were nervous about this. They didn't want to lose trade with China. And so they said, we need to have an open door policy. And this was Secretary of State John Hay who said this. And he said an open door policy was a policy that would allow all countries to trade freely with China, no matter the sphere of influence, no matter what was happening. We should all be able to sell things to China and buy things from China. And the other countries agreed, but they said, we support this idea. However, everyone else has to agree or else we're not going to enforce it. And so the United States, John Hay, went around and talked to each of these countries, and they all said the same thing. We support it, but unless everybody else does it, we're not going to do it. And so the United States said, we expect all of you to uphold your end of the bargain, and here we go, open door policy. The Chinese were not happy about this because they didn't get any power over their own lives, and so they started to develop organizations to fight against the foreign influence. One of the major ones we'll learn about on the next slide. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint question number 1. So one of these societies that we talked about on the last slide was called the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And they thought that Chinese society was being destroyed by two groups, by the foreign devils and the Chinese that had converted to Christianity. And so they came in and tried to destroy that. Them with some Chinese troops attacked embassies in a couple of cities, one of those cities being what is now Beijing. And they attacked him and killed more than 200 foreign people at these embassies. The German ambassador to China was one of the people that was killed. And so these countries responded, these major European countries who had spheres of influence, they responded. And Germany, Austria-Hungary, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, Russia, and the United States got together a multinational force, a big force, and came in and rescued the foreigners and put down the rebellion. And John Hay stepped in and said, okay, guys, I know you're going to want to punish China. You're going to want to take their land, split it up amongst yourselves and make colonies. But he said we shouldn't do that. We should not split them up. Please just accept financial payment back for all the damages that Chinese have done now to you, and let's keep trade open. Let's keep China as its own country and not take pieces of it for ourselves. And the countries mostly agreed with him, and so the United States was able to keep access to the trade for the things that were important from China, the tea, spices, and silk, as well as the most important thing from China, which is the people that you can sell your products to. So when William McKinley was shot and assassinated, killed, Theodore Roosevelt, his vice president, became the president of the United States. And he had some interesting feelings about diplomacy. He believed that the United States should continue to show their power around the world, and maybe even to increase their power. And he also accepted some of that Anglo-Saxonism ideals. He believed that the United States had a responsibility to shape what he called less civilized countries and turn them into more civilized, better running countries. One of the things that he did is he went straight to Asia and negotiated peace between Russia and Japan. They were fighting a war at this point, and he basically talked Russia into accepting some of the territorial gains, some of the gains that Japan had gotten, but he also got Japan to agree that they would not take any more territory and to recognize the independence of China. So those were big steps. Now, as time went on, the relationship between the United States and Japan got a little bit worse and worse and worse, but they both agreed to respect what the other one was doing in Asia, and to agree to that open door policy that we had talked about before. With Theodore Roosevelt, he believed in diplomacy as a big stick policy, he called it, or big stick diplomacy, because he believed in an African proverb that said the best way to get far is to speak softly and carry a big stick. Okay, so you have this power, you're showing your power, you always have the power and that fear from other people, but you're going to speak softly. You're just going to talk normally and try to help people out and try and do the right thing. But if those people won't allow you to do the right thing, you have the big stick to exert your power on them. And so the United States' power would keep other people from fighting, was his thought. He also got very involved and was the man who was able to complete the Panama Canal. Now, the Panama Canal had been started a long time ago by France, okay? So France had started first. They gave up in about 1889, and the U.S. thought this canal was absolutely necessary if they were going to stay a major power in the world, because going around to get to Pacific Ocean, going all the way around South America was just not a good option. They needed a quicker route running through the middle of Central America. with their ships. And so they knew it was necessary. So in 1902, Congress authorized buying this French company who had started the canal, buying their assets and buying the construction of the canal and continuing work on it. Now, the only problem was at this point, Panama was a part of Colombia. And so America needed to now um, get Colombia on board with them and allow them to rent it. So they offered a large amount of money, a big amount of money right now. And if you accept this money, then you're going to allow us to rent every single year for the rest of forever this land so that we can control the area of the canal and the area right around the canal. And Colombia refused. They said, we will not give you this control of this land. And so at this point, the Panamanians, Panama people, were fighting against the Colombians being in charge of them. They didn't like it. And so very quickly, seeing his option here, his best option, Theodore Roosevelt realized that maybe if he backed the Panamanians, then they would sell him or rent him this land. And so the United States sent gunships in to wait offshore and quote unquote protect American assets. So again, big stick diplomacy, showing off this power that we have, and if you don't do what we want, then we'll use it. And so Panama was able to push back the Colombians with the help of these American gunships. And the United States very quickly recognized Panama as a country, and Panama was able to sign a deal very quickly to the Americans for the canal to be built. So it seems like one of those under the table, sneaky kind of deals. And so the Americans started to build the canal. The canal took a long time. It was hard work. Many people died. And it did get completed, but one of the biggest things that came out of it, outside of the canal actually being completed, was there was a problem with malaria and yellow fever, and a lot of people didn't know what it was or how it was spreading amongst these people. They thought it was the humid air. They thought it was a lot of different things. But William Gorgas was able to come down, and he was able to he was the Surgeon General of the U.S. Army, and he was able to pinpoint that it was actually being carried by mosquitoes and by bugs. And so he was able to create a canal zone and eliminate the mosquitoes from that area, making a zone where they could not live. And that helped to solve the problem and stop the sickness and weakness and things like that were slowing down building of the Panama Canal. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint question number 2. So the United States started to become more of a presence and more of a power in Latin America in this area just to our south. And so we added on to the Monroe Doctrine. It was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Roosevelt Corollary said that we recognize that Latin American countries owe a lot of money to European countries. And so we're going to add this piece onto the Monroe Doctrine that says that the United States will intervene. They'll come in and change things in Latin America when it's necessary to keep economic and political stability in the Western Hemisphere. So what they wanted was to keep Europe out of the Americas. It's none of your business. We'll take care of it here. We'll be the superpower over in the Western Hemisphere, and you stay away from us. And basically what they would do is they would go in and intervene. So if you owed a lot of money, like the first time that it was used, the Dominican Republic owed a whole bunch of money to a bunch of European nations. And instead of incentivizing those European nations to come in and invade and try and get their money back, the United States went down, took over part of the Dominican Republic government, and used the Marine Corps to collect customs tariffs, to collect money in the Dominican Republic to send out to pay those European debts that it had. And so that was a big thing. And then the next president came in, President William Howard Taft, and President Taft believed in something called dollar diplomacy. And dollar diplomacy is basically, if we want to get along with and have power and control over different countries, then we need to have economic business interests that are mixed in with those diplomatic interests. So we need to own most of the businesses in those countries, and then we're going to have most of the power in those countries. And so the way that he wanted to control other countries was by increasing American business investment in those other countries. So by building businesses and railroads and canals and all that kind of stuff, he felt like being in control of all of the infrastructure and business would allow you to be in more control of that other country. Woodrow Wilson became the 28th president of the United States, and he kind of said an interesting thing. He said that it would be an irony of fate if his administration had to deal mostly with foreign affairs. And so as he was inaugurated, because his main expertise, what he had worked on his entire life, was domestic policy and dealing with government within the country. But most of his presidency, what was he doing? He was dealing with other countries and making decisions about foreign affairs as imperialism kind of folded into World War I. And so the Mexican Revolution is one of the first things that he had to deal with. The dictator Porfirio Diaz had grown Mexico, had made it much bigger, much more powerful, much better economically, but he had grown it using foreign investors from other countries. So most Mexican people, most actual Mexican people, were still poor because the businesses that were growing the country were owned by people in other countries. And so a revolution happened. And over this time, there was this man, his name was Francisco Madero, and he thought he was trying to create this new democracy and fix poverty and do that kind of stuff, but he just wasn't very good at running a government. And so being worried about his policies and all that kind of stuff, the more conservative forces kind of plotted against him. And in 1913, this general by the name of Victoriano Huerta seized power and Madero was murdered. Okay, and so this brutal general took power, and Wilson said he would not recognize the government. Woodrow Wilson, he said, I'm not going to do that. He said if a Latin American country is going to come in and new people are going to become in power, they need to have a government that's based on law and not based on force and fear, or I will not recognize them as a country or as an ally. And so he refused to do that, and he thought that eventually Huerta would be completely kicked out of power because they didn't have the backing of the United States. But also he started to intercept any weapons that were headed to Mexico, okay, to arm the Mexican government, General Huerta, and he allowed American companies to give weapons to arm the general's opponents. So just trying to help out that other side that was fighting against this guy that he didn't like. And so this conflict with Mexico started to grow, and American sailors that were in Tampico, Mexico in April 1914 wandered into a restricted zone, and they were arrested. They were very quickly released back to their commander, but the American commander demanded an apology from the government of Mexico, and the government of Mexico refused. And so this made the American people angry. They saw it as an act of aggression, and so Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and asked them to authorize use of force. And so as soon as that use of force was authorized, they noticed that a German ship was unloading weapons in Veracruz, Mexico, which America didn't want to happen. And so the United States came in, stopped this from happening, and took over the city by force. Okay. And at this point, we thought that the Mexicans would welcome us and that they'd be happy to be out from under the thumb of this General Huerta. But really, the Mexicans were upset because the Americans had come in and gotten into their business and taken their land. And so international mediation did happen between other countries, came in and tried to solve the problem. And eventually, the president was removed, and a new president, Venustiano Carranza, who was backed by the Americans, became the president of Mexico. And a lot of the Mexican forces that were against Carranza were not happy, and they started to conduct raids in the United States, and we're going to see one of those famous people who did that. This famous man who conducted raids into the United States was Pancho Villa. In 1916, he took a group of guerrillas. Guerrillas are armed fighters who are out there trying to carry out surprise attacks, sneaking around, stuff like that, to do raids into America. And he raided into America multiple times and eventually got to Columbus, New Mexico, and burned the town to the ground. Ended up killing 17 Americans. And so the American government sent about 5,800 troops and General John J. Pershing across the border, chasing Pancho Villa into Mexico to try to catch him. They chased him all around. It was really difficult. They couldn't get a hold of him. And so eventually the Americans had to give up because there was some other stuff happening over in Europe, which is kind of that precursor to World War I that we're going to talk about in the next unit. So this was a failure, right? And a lot of this entire diplomatic mission with Mexico was a total failure. What he was trying to do was trying to force people into democracy the way that we see it, trying to force them into being a quote-unquote better country, right? And you can't do that. If people want to run it the way that they want to, it's none of your business. You just have to work within how they work. And so this moral imperialism is kind of what they talk about with what Woodrow Wilson felt, where he wasn't necessarily trying to take things over by force, but he was trying to make them better and help them out, saying that we know what's better. Okay, it was really no different than taking over anything by force. And really, even though he was against imperialism and Roosevelt was for imperialism, he used just as much force in other countries as Roosevelt had in the years before Wilson had taken over as president. Take some time to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, then create 3 test questions that you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.